Um, I would say the motivation for wanting to make church a safe place for folks with religious trauma really is rooted in my own history. I grew up in a part of church world where there were very specific ways in which folks were told they did not belong, and while there was a lot of life-giving parts of being in church and that specific church that raised me. I mean, a lot of what a lot of the beauty of my journey and the trajectory of my journey, I really credit to that church community loving me in such profound ways. But I also saw it as a place in which people were harmed. One of the ways in which I saw people harmed was um, folks who are dealing with some pretty severe depression or mental illness, anxiety. Um, those were often framed as um, a weakness of faith or just a reluctance to give it all to God in prayer, in that it really put the burden on the individual to sort of exercise enough spiritual will to get over it, to get to that next stage, as opposed to really encouraging and walking with people to get the kind of treatment that they needed. Um, there were other ways in which I saw people of various sexualities. The way in which leadership was defined by male only. Um, there was a way in which there were just people who were very much made to feel less than, and I had very good friends and people that I'm very connected to even to this day that were so deeply wounded by that, to the point that they didn't even think that they could walk in the doors of a church again, and some haven't. Um, and while I think I occupied a pretty privileged space in that church setting, I was made to feel that I did belong and did matter, and I could have a kind of authority, there in ways that they couldn't. But even still, there were parts of that spiritual formation that were harmful too. And so there was a time where I really didn't want to be inside a church at all. And the way that I was taught to imagine God as a being that was always on the edge of punishing, that I had to do everything in my power just to convince this God that I was all in, that I believed enough, that I was a faithful person, and wouldn't be thrown into hell for eternity. These were things that it was an imagination of God that was kind of based in fear, and so that can traumatize a person. If your whole life is premised on just trying to impress a deity enough so that you don't have to suffer eternal damnation. I mean, that's a kind of trauma in itself, and so. Different people have different layers of different types of trauma in church, but for me, I was able to connect with communities of faith that not only helped me work through that religious trauma for myself, but it also modeled for me ways in which they were walking with other people who had experienced religious trauma, and I could see the real beauty of what's possible in church, that it could be a place of not just refraining from traumatizing people in the ways I had seen, but it was actually the place where people who had religious trauma could go to find community, to find healing, to even find a different kind of spirituality that could be the soil out of which healing could grow. So my experience of those kinds of communities of faith is really what reignited a desire to be in ministry, to still be in a church setting, so I could be a part of that kind of community for others. Some of the challenges that arise from trying to connect with people who have suffered some kind of religious trauma in their past. Um, I guess some of the challenges of addressing religious trauma can get down to just being a source of change in institutions that maybe haven't fully disconnected from ways in which um, their theology or practices have been traumatizing to folks. Change can be hard in any setting, and when I have tried to paint a different kind of picture of God that celebrates all people regardless of their gender or who they love. That's met with a great deal of resistance at times because, folks have been taught a certain way and really hold on to that belief, and it matters to them. And so just within church communities itself, evolving in how we practice the faith, evolving in even what we believe, what we imagine God to want from us, and the kinds of peoples that God celebrates. Those are real challenges, and we have to work through them. But then there's also challenges that arise from just trying to connect with individuals who have religious trauma in their past, just to even give church a chance. And so, coming on a Sunday morning can just produce such a visceral reaction that just all kinds of memories and painful experiences in church, all that can come flooding to the surface when you just even walk through the doors or you enter a sanctuary space. And so just getting over that hurdle can be quite difficult. And I have found that that just connecting with folks, knowing that I'm a pastor, even just connecting with them in a coffee shop or outside of church, that's often the best way to overcome those initial challenges, because just being near a space called church that looks like a church, that can be really, really difficult. And I honor that, I validate that pain, I understand the reality of that pain, and try to connect with folks outside of the space of being in or near a space is harmful. So I think that one's capacity for empathy that's extended towards those with religious trauma is really the key. Rather than, it would be very easy for someone who is a pastor of a church, talking with someone who has very sort of negative things to say about church just writ large, has broad generalizations about church in any form, in any place, because of their specific experiences that were harmful to them in a church. It could be easy to just be very defensive and be like, well, my church isn't like that, or not all churches. But empathy kind of allows you to put that in check and just understand where they're coming from. And just to, rather than make statements that try to defend church, to more ask questions, to be curious about what exactly happened in your story with church, and try to put myself in their shoes and understand the depth of the pain that happened, that they experienced and still do. And then that begins to open up a kind of trust. If you're just curious about them, that shows I love you as my neighbor more than I love a particular institution that I'm willing to protect, even while I'm not willing to fully listen to you. It actually says, no, I want to listen to you because I see you're a person in pain, and I can feel it. And if you're willing to share with me, I want to listen. So empathy is the first step to connecting with people and building some trust. Because the only way someone with religious trauma will trust you is if they get a sense that you're actually interested in them, that you actually care for them. And that's not just true for people with religious trauma, but anybody. I would give to any other church leaders who want to know how to create a safe space for folks with religious trauma is just to make space for people to talk about it. To let honesty be a core value. To not feel that church can only thrive if we all just pretend that church is a great place and that it's a place that just radiates with nothing but God's beauty and presence, and that we all just have the most wonderful interactions. But we just need to be honest about how we've experienced church, with its beauty, but also with its capacity for harming others. We need to be honest about the ways in which the specific place where we are and where we serve does both, is beautiful, but is also very human and does makes real mistakes along the way and inflicts harm. So, allowing honesty, being honest with your own leadership, with your own experiences, and then allowing others to be honest as well, I think matters a lot. And giving people just the opportunity to share makes a huge difference. When people feel like their stories and their experiences are welcomed, and that honesty is prized, and that a church community can actually see them for their experiences and love them, even if on the one hand they're saying, I think church is broken, or I think, the idea of God is broken, if you can just not react defensively, but just love them wherever they are in that, that goes a really, really long way. I think church leaders can show compassion beyond words by making folks with religious trauma a priority. Don't just kind of be ready to show compassion when someone happens to mention it. But I think in the way that preachers preach, you can reference with honesty your own experience. You can acknowledge that people have been victims of faith communities that have done awful things. You can reference the beauty as well, but you can give space in the kind of programming you offer, whether it's a class or a community group, a small group, where people feel safe and are invited to share. I know that in my current place, we, for a while, were doing a thing called Theology on Tap, and it was a way to get outside of church. And my hope was that a setting at a bar where someone could get like a drink or even just some food, even if they didn't drink, that would be a setting that was very different than a church setting where folks would feel comfortable to go. You know what? I may not be willing to go inside a sanctuary or a fellowship hall to talk about God and talk about life, but I'd go to this place because I already like this place. This feels like home to me. And if you're willing to go to settings like that, show some initiative by creating some spiritual community or creating opportunities for dialogue in spaces like that, then you're showing that that this is not just something that is peripheral to us. This actually matters. We want to be church, do church better, and it can happen outside of the walls, and it can happen in such a way where we can break some of the stereotypes of how people might imagine church to be. I've certainly faced challenges in trying to connect with folks who've lost trust in the church. Just knowing that I'm a pastor can kind of shut down conversations. So, classic example, sitting on an airplane, somebody asks you, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a pastor. And if they have a really painful experience with church in their past, I can just see their eyes glaze over, and I can see their just attention shift and just a wall go up. And so, I become a placeholder for whatever it is that they've experienced in church. And that can happen even with folks that I know, so it's just being able to demonstrate a kind of love and an openness to hear their story, and that can be a real challenge. But you just have to be okay with that. I don't feel the need to convince every single person, who doesn't want to talk to any single, I don't feel like it's my job necessarily to try to convince every person I encounter who's lost trust in the church that they ought to. It's okay to just let the lost trust be there, because I'm sure in their situations, many of these situations, the lost trust is merited. And I think if I can just demonstrate a kind of love for them, that's enough. Whether the outcome of the interaction is a new curiosity about church, or the imagination of church could be different. Whether that happens or not, that doesn't matter. But just being a person who signals an authenticity of love and interest in them, that's enough. do a lot of listening and a lot of not talking. It's been said you got 2 ears and 1 mouth so that you can do twice as much listening as talking. And so I think the best kind of practice for trying to connect with someone with religious trauma is just being willing to listen, asking a question that invites a sharing and signals an interest in their story, being willing to really empathize with the pain that they felt. That's critical, and having just very little to say, but just being with them and just understanding that if they're sharing their story with you, they have invited you into a very, very sacred space, and to honor and reverence the fact that they've invited you into that space by sharing with you. That kind of space does not require our talking or our explaining, church-splaining their pain or their trauma, but just listening and being there. That's the best thing I think we could do. When I hear stories that are so painful, sometimes I just can't help but just start tearing up, and there's nothing that can be said. I think the impulse is to want to say something that could help alleviate the pain or help take it away from them, but some of these stories are just so horrific that you just can't help but just grieve with them. And so I think the key is just not to plug your ears and kind of, shut it down, but just to keep listening. And if the reaction is to just cry, then cry. If the reaction is to just be stunned in silence, then to be stunned in silence with them. But I think that reaction, that kind of reaction signals that you're actually in touch with the reality of the story being shared with you. A quick change of subject, because you can't stomach the story. That just, I found that it takes effort to try to keep listening, but if you're willing to keep listening, then even if you don't have a solution or even a productive next step, even if there's nothing that you can say to help alleviate the pain in yourself or the person sharing the story, just to keep listening and not turn away. That's the best thing I can do when hearing a story this is hard to hear. I think humility plays a huge role in rebuilding trust, because for one, I'll just speak of my own experience. Part of what I have had to learn as a church leader is not just how to find healing with my own pain that has come from church spaces, but I've had to learn the kind of humility to recognize that I have been not just on the receiving end, but on the other end of inflicting harm as a church leader. There have been things that I have said, there's been things that I've been a part of, a kind of culture, a church culture that I've been part of the fabric of that has been harmful to others. And while I would much rather not admit that to myself or to God or anybody else, the fact is, when I'm honest with myself, I'm truly humbled to know that there's got to be, here's a good church word, some repentance in there for the ways in which I've been a part of inflicting harm. I've been a part of traumatizing situations. And being able to deal with that with God individually, but also collectively within community, with folks that are committed to help me do better and for us to do better, that goes a long, long, long way. So yes, humility is being willing to say all the bad people that do bad stuff aren't just out there, but that, even in my context, even in my church, even in my own role, we can mess up pretty royally. And if we're willing, people can help us see it, and then we can help ourselves and help our churches by having the capacity to hear it and also committing to do better.